On today's video lesson, we're going to cover photosynthesis. Now, this is a quick recap of the information we need for class. So again, photosynthesis is when plants take that light energy from the sun, and they're going to then convert it to the chemical energy essentially in their food. And that food is going to be glucose. And we've talked a lot about glucose when it comes to cell respiration. And what's happening is that light energy is helping taking in our glucose, and that energy really is going to be in electrons. And we've talked about how important electrons are in the process of cell respiration and in bonding all year long. So it's really taking and harnessing that light energy in the form of electrons and getting it into the bonds of glucose. So we've talked a lot about that. And so if you remember our balanced equation, it's going to be 6 CO2, so the plant gets carbon dioxide out of the air, 6 waters. And the waters, they're going to come from the ground through the roots and up into the leaves through the veins. They're going to take that light energy, which generally they're going to get from the sun out in nature. And through that, they're going to do very complex chemical reactions, and they're going to build some glucose. And in the process, they're going to give off waste products of oxygen. And so again, this is the oxygen that we breathe. And without this trash from photosynthesis, we wouldn't be here. Now, when it comes to this balanced equation for our class, I'm going to ask you also then, underneath the chemicals, we want to essentially write on each side 21 and 21. And as you're in high school, you all believe that life starts at 21, so you can kind of remember that. So a 2 under the carbon dioxide, a 1 under the water, a 2 under the glucose, and a 1 under the oxygen. Again, this is a little way to help you kind of remember what happens in photosynthesis. Now, going back to photosynthesis, this is a process that essentially happens in 2 steps. So it's easy to remember those steps because of the word photosynthesis. So we take and we break this word in half. The photo part deals with light. And synthesis, we've already talked about dehydration synthesis reactions, means to build. And this is where we're actually going to, the plant's going to build its sugar. Again, in that sugar is glucose, which is going to be its food. And that food is actually going to then burn in cell respiration. But we can break that down. Photo is the first part. Synthesis is the second. Now, officially, these steps are called the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions. And this is also known then as the Calvin cycle. So again, photosynthesis, 2 steps. So step number 1 are those light-dependent, so hence the light for the photosynthesis. And then step 2 is the light-independent reactions, which don't need direct sunlight, but what you're going to find out they need is they need the products of the first part to go into the second part. So it's not like these happen at night, but they rely on the products of the light-dependent reaction, but not light itself. So those are those 2 basic steps in photosynthesis. So here we have step number 1, the photo portion of photosynthesis. In this portion, what's going to happen is we're going to use light energy, and that light energy is actually then going to be stored directly in the form of electrons. So we've talked about how when sunlight hits electrons, they jump into the next shell, which is unstable, and they fall back down, and that's why we feel warm in the sun. Your car warms up in the sun. But plants have a special molecule that when that electron jumps up in energy level, before it falls back downward, turns to its stable state, it actually catches that electron. So now that electron has stored the energy from the sun. Now, the big part of this is for plants to go through and make their own sugar. But at the end of the day, to build something, we've learned that it needs energy. And that energy molecule of all cells to run reactions is ATP. So really what happens in this light portion of the reaction is they're going to harness light energy to drive the process to make ATP. And that is exactly like cell respiration. There's an electron transport chain in the first portion of this. So when the sun hits the electron and it jumps up energy levels and it's grabbed, it's then passed down an electron chain. And as it falls in energy, that energy is used to generate ATP. So now we have some of this ATP, but my electron has returned to this low energy state. So before we head off to that next level where we need high energy electrons for the bonds of the sugar, the sunlight will hit this same electron again. It'll jump up again to a higher energy state, and again it's grabbed at this higher energy state. So we've saved that energy from light and electrons, and we've generated ATP in the first step. So the end summary is, at the end of this step, we get some ATP, and we're going to get energized electrons. It's these then that we'll use in phase number 2 to actually build the glucose molecule. Something also very important about step number 1 is that this electron that was excited from the chlorophyll that jumps up and then falls down and then jumps up, is excited, and that'll be carried off by a taxicab to the second step. Well, we need to replace this electron here, or there's no more electrons to catch that sunlight energy. So what the chlorophyll does and the plant does is it takes the water molecule, rips that apart for its electrons, and in doing so is going to release oxygen. And this is the oxygen that we breathe. That is a waste product, and it comes from the ripped apart oxygen. If you remember back to cell respiration, it was our oxygen that picked up the electron at the end of the electron port chain and became water. So here you almost see this recycling. So not only do we get ATP and energized electrons as products that we want, but a waste product again is that oxygen. And that oxygen came from a water molecule that the plant ripped apart. In step number 2, which is the synthesis portion of photosynthesis, also known as the Calvin cycle, the plant's going to use the ATP and the electrons coming in from the first step, and what it's going to do is then take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that it gets in through its leaves and do a lot of chemical reactions and assemble those. And again, so we're building bonds, and that's why we need these high energy electrons and these ATP molecules. So they're going to build bonds, and through that process, they're going to build a glucose molecule, and this process is called carbon fixation. Again, for our purposes, we don't need to know all the steps. It's very complicated, but at the end of the day, carbon dioxide is being assembled by enzymes using the energy from ATP and those electrons for bonds, and they're going to make then this sugar molecule here, which again, that sugar is going to go off for cell respiration in the mitochondria. All right, so just like us, plants do cell respiration. So they actually just make their own food because they're autotrophs, but then they burn it in their mitochondria the way we do to generate a large quantity of ATP. As a recap of photosynthesis, we can go back to the balanced equation and looking at that 21 that I told you to put under each side. On the test, you're going to be asked, what happens in which step? Is it in the photo part or the synthesis part? So by looking at these, it'll tell you what's linked. So my 1s are linked together, and my 2s are linked together. So a question might be, in which step of photosynthesis does the plant rip apart water for its electrons? Well, that there will tell you it's in step number 1. Where does the oxygen that we breathe come from? Does it come from the oxygen on the water or the oxygen on the carbon dioxide? Well, if we trace our 1s, that tells us that the air we breathe comes from water. Where do the carbons come from to build the glucose? Well, they come from carbon dioxide because those 2s are linked. So if you're asked which step of photosynthesis does the plant take carbon dioxide and build sugar, that tells you there it's the synthesis part because it's step number 2. So this here is going to answer all of the questions on the test about which step does certain processes occur. The one thing that is not answered is the ATP. You'll be asked which step does ATP come in. Now again, that's going to be that first step. You can kind of look at that like A. It starts off with A as the first letter of the alphabet. So it happens in step number 1. Or you can remember that idea that the whole point of step number 1, or I guess I should say half the point, is to generate that ATP, because any chemical reactions in our body need ATP as an activation energy. So before the plant in step number 2 can actually build its sugar, it needs a way to go through and generate ATP so it can do that. So that's part of phase number 1. So again, the one thing that's not directly from this equation is this idea of ATP, but again, that happens in step number 1. It's, we take the electrons, we energize them to generate ATP in electron transport chain, and then re-energize those electrons so they've got lots of energy for this glucose, which will then take to cell respiration. And as you know, we slowly break it apart, take those high energy electrons, let them fall down, and as they fall down in energy, we harness that to generate lots of ATP. So hopefully, this has helped you understand the basics of what we need to know for photosynthesis.